All right. I'm going to say the Lord's Prayer before I start. Our Father in heaven, honored be thy name. May thy kingdom come. May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread. And forgive us of our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us on a righteous path. And guard us from evil one. And forgive us of our trespasses. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Just doing some sound checking at the same time. See how everything's going to sound. All right. So today is going to kind of be like a free flowing day. We're going to just kind of dig into where we left off at, which let me actually open this up. And we're going to go pinpoint into exactly the transition into the time frame of Bronze Age, which is going to be where mainly the biblical narrative is going to take place. You're thinking Abraham and all those individuals, right? So that's going to be very important. This is going to be very important for us to look at. So we're going to be looking at time frames between basically 4,000 to 2,000, right? So 4,000 to 2,000 is the time frame we're going to be looking at. So this time frame is what we're going to be looking at. So that's going to be very important. So from 4,000 to 2,000 is the time frame we're going to be looking at. All right. So let's just jump right in. All right. We're going to start from the note we was talking about the other day, and we're going to bring in some new information on some things because we got to talk about the Bronze Age, right? And we got to talk about what rises in that time, right after the flood, right? Babel, right? The moment of Babel. So we got to talk about the land, right? We already know what land they start at. We already proved it that they start in the area of Mesopotamia, right? After the Neolithic bottleneck, right? That's going to be very important. Just going to open one more note here that we need. So first things first, because a lot of people have a lot of different opinions on Nimrod. There's some great opinions, but there is one agreement that I think everyone comes to when it comes to Nimrod, that he would be the one involved with the building of Babel. So he would cause a lot of different effects. So we're going to kind of go about it first as in a few insights, and then we'll dive into it. So we're going to look at the truth of our world after the flood, right? So obviously the individuals who were there before the flood had some evidence of having iron and a couple different things. So just don't mind that. We're going to be looking into after the flood, right? The individuals under Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and one individual directly from him named Cush. Now, is a saying that's read in the Bible. It says, "And Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. And he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Why it was said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel." And now this is where we're going to look at too. You see these names here. What's interesting is these names, like this one, Akkad, right? Akkad is also where the Akkadians had connection to. Shinar is actually where Babylon is going to be, right? So what's interesting is it lets you know that Babel, and then it lets you know Shinar. Now, a lot of people know that Shinar is where Babylon, the later Babylon, is going to be at. So it's interesting how they give you Babel and then it gives you Shinar, right? And then this city is very important. This is one of the most important of all these cities, right? This is one of the most important, and we're going to go about it as we go about it. So let me just jump over here because we're going to talk about some insights that others speak about and stuff like that, because I think it's important to get a good insight. So we looked at not just Gilgamesh, we looked at a couple different possible candidates for being Nimrod, but we got to understand about the time frame and everything. So get a little idea of the family real fast. So we're going to have an understanding that the family here that we're going to be thinking about is going to be under him. And him has actually what looks like a massive family. But we got to be careful on how we go about that. So the one line we're going to look at is Cush. Now, remember, there was a curse to one of the sons of Ham. That was Canaan. but not Mizraim and not Cush. So they didn't receive a curse. But from Cush, based on like the normal idea, right? He brings forth Nimrod, right? So that's going to be kind of interesting to take a note of. Now, Nimrod, the name Nimrod is kind of interesting. Let's first look into that idea real fast on some things of Nimrod that I think is kind of interesting. So Nimrod, son of Cush, right? It talks about the founder of Babel, right? The kingdom, whatnot. We can see a couple of different places where he is spoken of and everything. He's spoken of later on in even in the Chronicles and whatnot. You can see where it talks about Nimrod, right? Being basically from Cush and everything. Now, what's also interesting is when it goes over some things of the name Nimrod, it may seem a little hard to find some interesting depth on it, but there's a couple of different scholars who have some interesting ideas on the name Nimrod. I just want to point out some interesting facts real fast. I'm going to read a highlight on just some things real fast. Some scholars basically, they actually say Nimrod actually came from a Semitic root, right? A language similar to ancient Hebrew. It says, the root appears to be a word roughly Romanized to marad, right? Meaning to rebel. Now, this is interesting because what we would notice here is that it will be a later change, right? Now, if it had to be Romanized, just the fact that it was Romanized, right? Even if something was Hellenized, Romanized meaning it would have to happen somewhere in the Iron Age of that idea, right? Because this Nimrod is often thought to have been a rebel against the Lord, right? So that's something that also we're going to take a look at some things, because he had to be a rebel for the type of way that the city fell, right? It didn't fall because he was doing something good. It fell because he was doing something bad, right? That's going to be very important. Now, it's interesting when you actually go into some of the interesting phrases of Nimrod and you look at the first few letters here, and it kind of reminds you of something. And let me just show you something real fast that I think is kind of interesting. Now, this is just the first few letters, and it sounds like Namer, right? And you can actually see it used for leopard, right? And what's interesting about that, in this couple scripture of Daniel that describes the leopard as part of the beast and whatnot. And it's interesting when you think about in the Bible, even in the New Testament, it talks about a mystery Babylon, right? And it kind of brings you to that idea of Babylon, even though we know Babylon fell a while ago. But Babylon was a kingdom that lasts a long time, that lasts a while, right? It also, that supposed to have a meaning, but also that name Nimrod was interesting. It has very close similarities. I'm just going to take this word here just to show you how close this is to a place in Moab, right? And it also is the same as Namer, right? So what we were just kind of looking at there, which actually is leopard. So you can see what's going on there. So you can see I'm going to put these two next to each other to kind of show you how similar they basically look. Besides that, the last part on it, you see right there, very similar if you take a first look at what's going on there. Now, I'm gonna let you know why all that's kind of interesting when you think about that. So, interesting location, right? It's also a very interesting. There's very interesting ways that it's used in Scripture. For example, in Jeremiah 48 and 34, right? It says, "From the cry of Heshbon to Eliah, and to Jahaz." Sorry if I say his name weird. They have uttered their voice from Zorah to, you can see, I'm not going to try to pronounce that one, like a 3-year-old heifer. So they're basically crying out. But it's interesting what's going on here. It's talk about basically some of the area being desolate. Now, this part is actually talk about when Israel had went down into Egypt. If you know about this part and the complexity of it, I'll just show a quick sample why this is kind of interesting. Why these things are related, because it's just kind of talking about Moab and everything and where he's going and everything. So it's using that place name and talk about where he's going to go and whatnot, and a couple different things. But it's relating. It's almost like if you look very closely in the scriptures, you can almost see some like, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost like some mirroring that happens. That's kind of interesting to take note of at times. But we're going to point that out as I point out the locations of where they come from. Also, Isaiah is also interesting. It kind of talks about prophecy in a little different way and whatnot, which is, let me just go to it where we can see it here, just so you can see the whole thing. So also going on Moab and everything, talk about what's going to happen and everything, and then talks about a place, right, for the waters of Narim, right, shall be desolate, whatnot. A couple different things like that, right? We're gonna go back and interesting how that same word also means namer, which also is the sense of leopard and whatnot. You can think about, you know, some different places where that's used in scripture, just like in the prophecy and whatnot. But you know, it's really interesting when you take that into note when we look at some interesting things of the land. I'll first point out something. All right, so fresh blank mind. Let's kind of dive into, like we said, right? That was just kind of like an introduction of some interesting things before we dive in. So 4,000 to 2000 BC. That's going to be the time frames we're going to look at. Just to kind of do that note. But first, as always, before we get to those time frames, we got to build to those time frames. Right. So first, as with all those Ham, Shem, and Japheth, we got to note the first people would have settled in the. Let me make sure I point this out. Remember what we was pointing out yesterday? We got to make sure before we get Babel and everything, people would have settled in the world, right? They would have settled all over and everything. So they would have settled in the, I would say, area, branching out till they return to construct Babel. So that's important. So first things first, right? First things first. That's important to know. So gotta plant that understanding before we go into these deep sources, because we do have evidence before certain buildings that I'm gonna show you that are called ziggurats. Before these temple buildings are built, there's gonna be early settlements that we was pointing out yesterday that happened during the Neolithic time frame, right? For example, this little settlement here, this one right here is actually going to be very early. It's going to be earlier before what we're going to look at, which is at this area here. And we're going to get a little understanding of what's going on in, I'm going to say it, because there's different ways to say it, Eridu, right? So we're going to get a little idea of Eridu. But this little area is actually the earliest known human settlement in southern Mesopotamia. So that was in the Neolithic. It's just one of those Neolithic locations and everything, but it is a site that is found that has early people, right? Evidence early people, right? So it just says a surface survey showed that the site was occupied into the Uruk period. Why the Uruk period? Because we got to find Nimrod, and it's going to involve the Uruk period, the Uruk time frame. For example, we're going to look into some interesting studies. So within Uruk, the greatest monument was basically the Anu Ziggurat, right? Ziggurat, on which the White Temple was built. So just to kind of show what's going on there. So we're going to Uruk, right? They're going to go to the earliest temples that pop up in these lands, right? Now we're going to that's when we're going to also get that legend that we were talking about yesterday, right? The Epic of Gilgamesh, right? That's going to pop up in these lands. And notice it's going to also be interesting because we're going to also connect ideas of Nimrod, right? So this land has some very important things. So scholars identify Uruk as the biblical, you see this name right here? Remember I told you this name was very important, right here. So this is why we're going this way. So this name right here is actually going to have some very important ties to this one, okay? So we're going to dive into the actual history of these things. That's why we was building like that, because it's going to really lead us to the biblical narrative. It's going to all come to synchronisms and alignments. So until we get to Abraham coming up in the time of Egypt in the 13th dynasty. So let's get a little understanding of what's going on here. So at this time, we're going to get some things kind of combining together, reality and the book. So let's get kind of a dive into these things, right? Let's not be afraid of how deep these things can go, because they can go deep at times. But it's going to show you the reality of why it said to Abraham, you know, leave your family and you can come and go this way, you know. Let me see how the sound is, just to make sure everything's all right. Go this way. All right. That's good. All right, so let me just move that out of the way. So yeah, this is I usually don't go live at these times. I usually go live at 3, but for me, from where I'm at, it's, you know, a little different. But this is just a little highlight of what we was talking about, that some of the first ziggurats that were built. Now, what's interesting about these is that they have the foundation, the construction design that will be needed for what is designed as that Tower of Babel, right? But we gotta get into the details on how we know that all those things are going to unite with this time. But I just want to kind of show these visuals of how these things look, right? How does land look? So it's obviously this is an aerial view of it, right? So this is just an interesting concept of it, right? One of the earliest ziggurats, and we're talking right after the transition of the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, right? So that's going to be very interesting for those things, very deep. But look what it says. It says within that time, like we have talked about before, the legendary king Gilgamesh, according to the chronological, I pretty much what's presented in the Sumerian kings list, right? It says ruled, right, Uruk in the 27th century BC. So that's kind of interesting, because we were just pointing that out before, that in that society, in that kingdom, there was a king that almost seems in the midst of the middle of being legendary and reality, right? So very interesting to get some of these things. So just kind of dive a little more into it, right? Archaeological evidence showed that the earliest structures date to the 6th millennium BC, right? It just talks about that land, right, where those ziggurats and everything. So it's going to talk about is going from the transition of the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, like we was pointing out before. So all that Neolithic, the animals settle in different areas, the humans in different areas, right? They're all in different areas, and then all of a sudden they all go to one place. Because that's also why I always put stuff in the description. For example, the video yesterday. What scripture is the video yesterday? I put something in the description. I always put extra information. So this was what we was talking about yesterday. The whole earth was one language and one speech, right? And it came to pass later on, right? That's important. So now we're going to focus on that later on. All those things that happened later on, right? That's why we was building up to Nimrod, because Nimrod had to be born in that time, but then he's going to settle himself at the lands of Shinar, right? So they're going to journey to the land of Shinar, and they're going to dwell there, right? And that's why we're going to talk about Nimrod, right? Because it says the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and the one that we are looking at, right? Uruk, Akkad, right? And this other one, and Shinar, which is actually pre-Babylon, or even the Semitic word for Babylon, right? And if you're interested, I also put some information of the word Nimrod to the roots of him, which is also very interesting when you look at some of his roots of his name and everything, when it talks about he is the mighty hunter and everything, whatnot, right? So very, very interesting. But just to kind of point, the reason why I point that out, because we went into a little highlight of Gilgamesh, and I'm gonna just tell you why, based on this scholar's report. According to tablets, Gilgamesh was from Uruk, right? A city, right? Attributed to Nimrod. So both of them were from the same city, right? Just like it says in Genesis 10:8-11, right? States that Nimrod established a kingdom, right? Since the Babylonian kingdom seems to be one of the earliest, if not the first kingdom on earth, it stands to reason that such an event would be recorded in extra biblical literature, right? So it just means like literature outside of the Bible. So if that happened, right? If Nimrod settled a city in one of the most hot spots of the areas in Mesopotamia, right? If he would have settled there, he probably would have been an early group, right? Not only was the Epic of Gilgamesh recorded on Sumerian tablets, but similar tales are found among the Assyrian and Hittite cultures as well. Scholars and translators of the cuneiform tablets that contain the Gilgamesh epic agree that text was composed around 2000 BC, while the material written about the numerous episodes of adventure relate to a much earlier time period, probably not long after the floods. So you see what's going on there? Because these are actually when the flood tales start popping up. I'm talking multiple flood tales at the same time popping up after the evidence of the Neolithic bottleneck, right, where all the animals were pretty much replaced in different areas, right? All those animals after the Neolithic came out of that bottleneck. All the humans came out of that bottleneck, right? Because that was a massive wipe out event. It says both. So it says there are many similarities between Nimrod and Gilgamesh, right? Both were known as great builders and mighty warriors. They were from the same era, arguably lived around the same time, period. Right. So very, very interesting. What was that from? That was from this individual who is pretty much a social scientist, researcher, and acclaimed historian for at least 2 decades. Right. I'll just show you that. All right. Nice. Here, just to kind of give you a little highlight on some of these things. So here he is. If you want to know a little bit about him, you can contact him and whatnot and get in contact with him and whatnot. And he thought that, yes, there's a lot of evidence for those things, for that similarity. And I think so too, right? I think so too. And I think that the similarities are looking very aligned. And also looking at what happens at that time is kind of interesting as well. And that's what we're gonna do. Is look at that. Now, I did look at a lot of different concepts. I thought IP's idea was interesting, but there was some problems with it because the fact that the languages also divided after that time. So what's interesting is Sumerian is a lingua franca that is very original at that time, but what happens is the script dramatically changes, right? First you have Sumerian with pictographic script, and then all of a sudden you're going to get that later script change that is going to be like a mix with that Akkadian, and that's going to be kind of interesting to take a note of on how a couple different things change. What I think would be more of the Sumerian change to the Akkadians changes. So I think that is really interesting to know. But I'll give you an interesting insight that someone kind of put.
One of the more notable characteristics about Nimrod is his rebellion against the biblical God. You might say that this guy was on a mission to disobey God, and with his fearsome reputation as a renowned hunter, it's no wonder so many people align themselves with him. Gilgamesh, on the other hand, was believed to be the greatest Babylonian king who ever lived, a man who was so strong and powerful that he was part god himself. Theories have since sprouted up that suggest that both of these men were actually the same person. You see, both were deemed as phenomenal builders and mighty warriors, and both were said to have lived around the same time period. In one particular idea, it can be said that both feared the coming of a second great flood, or at least feared death. It can be said that Nimrod built the Tower of Babel to escape the flood, whilst Gilgamesh sought out Utnapishtim, who had achieved immortality, in order to learn how to achieve it himself.
All right, so I think that's an interesting thought. I think that's an interesting idea, an interesting thought Now there's other writers that write some interesting things, and we're going to look at what some later historians say, because I think it is fine to look at what other historians also say on some things, right? But we can also note that how sources work, right? Now, the reason why I'm using Gilgamesh and all that is because it's more closer to Nimrod's time, but we can go to like maybe some individuals that would probably be that 1,000 years later, maybe, and then get an idea of what they think of some things, right? And we'll do that. We'll also look at that. So the world at that time, also what's interesting about that time is that's when we get the transition that I was talking about, that we're going to get a transition of writing that's going to happen a little bit after what happens at Babel. Now, what's believed is that right in the middle where we have the Akkadians and Sumerians, there was a lingua franca early on. So there was a lingua franca early on. So right around this area, they would start to develop a lingua franca. And the first lingua franca is actually the Sumerian language, right? Then later on, there's going to be an Akkadian lingua franca. But the Sumerian language was like an ancient language that was just, almost the language of it was even lost at some point. But it was recently translated and understood. But the whole world at that time is going to be important to note how it is going to look at this time. So how the world is going to look at the time where Nimrod is going to be there, and then finally Babel is finally rised up. So if you see the Kassites here, you can see right here the Kassites. They're actually going to be one of the groups that bring forth the first dynasty or recorded dynasties of Babylon, right? The first dynasty of Babylon. We're talking like old Babylon, proto-Babylon, right? The Kassites in the transition of the removing of the Amorites and whatnot in that land. And that's going to be kind of interesting to take note of the difference of the Sumerians, then the Akkadians, then the first rise of the later groups of Babylon. So when I say Babylon, remember, these kingdoms have proto, they have middle, and they have neo forms of them. And Neo-Babylon is when Nebuchadnezzar pops up. I'm saying, when I say Nebuchadnezzar, I'm talking Nebuchadnezzar II, or Nebuchadnezzar who besieges Jerusalem and takes Daniel and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all that. Like that's what's important, that the kingdom of Babylon will be after the Kassites take over that land and whatnot. Now that's kind of interesting to take note of. But first, let's kind of proceed on in this, because I think it's actually interesting to get into the insight of this. So that's why we're looking at this when we talk about what's going on in those areas, right? So they settled in that area. So they would have settled in this land. So it just shows you some of those baked bricks, right? Isn't that interesting when you think about it? How they build Babel, right? They use some very certain material that was used there. We'll talk about some of that too. But this is going to be one of the cities that's there, right? So that's very interesting. I thought this was a very interesting concept, right? This is just from this insight here, right? From ancient origins, right? Just talk about Eridu. How you say that, Eridu? That's going to be the Sumerian, they say, Garden of Eden, and the oldest city in the world, right? And they just go and talk about that. Now, probably not the oldest city in the world, because that's going to be pre-flood cities that we were talking about, pre-flood towns and whatnot. But this is going to be like the oldest, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like official city where we're going to get like and the places where Abraham leaves and whatnot. Now, we can also talk about like there's another side where we got Uruk and all those things, but this is more talking like the more consensus that we have proven. So I'm going to show you an interesting thing that's said by this person that studies really deep.
District, but it was historically significant as both writing and monumental public architecture emerged here. The combination of these two developments place Iana as arguably the first true city and civilization in human history. The first examples of cuneiform writing was found in the Iana district. Uruk was not only one of the first cities, it was the main force of urbanization and state formation as well. For 800 years between 4000 BCE and 3200 BCE, The area saw a shift from small agricultural villages to a larger urban city center with a full-time bureaucracy, military, and society. The Uruk period culture expanded by Sumerian traders and colonists and had an effect on all surrounding peoples who gradually evolved their own comparable competing economies and cultures. Around 3100 BCE, Uruk reached its peak growth with approximately 40,000 residents living inside the city walls. The legendary king Gilgamesh ruled Uruk in the 27th century BCE. He was posthumously deified and he became a major figure in Sumerian legend during the Akkadian rule. Gilgamesh was a major hero in ancient Mesopotamian mythology and the protagonist of the Epic of Gilgamesh, an epic poem written in Akkadian during the late 2nd millennium BCE. Around 2334 BCE, the Akkadian Empire slowly took over the Sumerian civilization, eventually uniting both civilizations under Akkadian rule.
All right, so you saw what it's saying there. So remember, it was Sumer first, and they're gonna have a lingua franca. We'll talk about that, and then the Akkadians take over, right? And they're gonna have some difference to those two. So those groups are gonna be majorly important to note the difference was going on there. But note, that's when we're gonna get the Epic of Gilgamesh at the Sumerian Empire. Here's a real. What you're seeing here is a actual reconstruction of what the land would have looked like where Nimrod was, right? And this is just giving you a kind of an insight of what that town would look like. I'll just show you that this is actually from a couple of different scholars. So you got some individuals from these universities and whatnot that came together and basically wanted to make a pretty much, I'll just tell you a little bit of what it is. It's pretty much a reconstruction of the 3000 BC area, because that would have been pretty much an area where we would get a lot of these individuals rising. Here's just some interesting concepts I thought was interesting. Some people walking around, right? So just to bring reality to visuality, right? So I thought that was interesting how they worked about that. I think it's interesting how they look as well, right? Their tone is like a mid-brown tone. I had talked about this before, that Mesopotamia would have probably had a mid-brown tone like this. This would have made sense for the time and the area, because it was a very fertile area and it was very warm. So that's something that we did know in this area. But I thought this town was very interesting. So you can kind of get a interesting look of it, right? You can see some animals over there and whatnot, and some people moving around and whatnot. And you can see different things happening in the city. It's a couple of different things happening in that little city. But they seem very, very close. But there's a lot of things that's happening there. So they took the time of making that so we can kind of see what it would look like reconstructed like that. And not just like a random drawing, but like kind of like actual using the groundwork to bring it to a visual reality. So Nimrod seemed to have risen, right? Seemed to had. Let's put that had. Does that make much sense? Seemed to have risen at a time of a major lingua franca in the land of the Fertile Crescent. Now, the reason why I'm saying that Nimrod seemed to have risen when there was a lingua franca is because it seems that there was a change. There was a dramatic change, and they quickly made a lingua franca. So that's what I'm saying, is that we proven, what did we prove the other day? We proved that they had an ultimate language, that when they left the ark, scientifically, we know that humans had an ultimate language. And then when they got to Babel, they started to construct languages. So they started to construct the language. So what happened was they had, most likely, like I had pointed out before, they most likely, when they came to Babel, they already were speaking a type of language that wasn't recorded yet. But it was like a language that they all knew. They all had, maybe they had different ways of speaking, right? Just like how in America, right? If you go to like someone from the South, they speak different than someone in Chicago, right? Or someone in Chicago speak different than someone in New York, but they all speak this like type of English, right? And some of them even got some Spanish, and they got slang to their Spanish, and different languages with their own slang. But at this time, they would have a common language with different slangs or different ways that they're speaking those languages, if you understand what I'm saying. But then when the Sumerians come, they build a lingua franca. What I'm saying is that not that it's in the Sumerian, it's right before the Sumerian, and then the development of that lingua franca, which happens at about the 4,000. Because remember, this area been here since the Neolithic, but at the time of the Bronze Age, when the language starts to develop, that's when the lingua franca pops up. So it's going to be in the transition between 4,000 and 2,000, and 3,000 to 2,000 is where we're going to get Babel. So the transition from here is when the settlements are going to be happening, and then we're going to get that full setup. We're going to explain it as we go, point it out, right? So Sumerian is historically the first language following our criteria of a lingua franca. So there it is, a lingua franca. Now, if lingua franca, I'm going to point out too how it's not the same like a language that like someone else has. And we're going to show how that is, because at that same time, another language developed in Egypt, and it wasn't a lingua franca, but we got a lingua franca in the areas of Mesopotamia. That's going to be important, because that's what we talk about. Shinar was a little town where everyone was gathered, where they all had this common language. So it says right here, a lingua franca having all the criteria mentioned, right? It is also the first written language used originally for obviously economic and a couple of different things, right? Standardification and whatnot. But with the centuries, it developed from an administrative language to a literary one, right? And devised a writing system, right? So devised a writing system that would last for more than 3 millennia. So that's very interesting. So it's going to show that that writing system is going to develop later, and that's going to be the language that lives on after the broken language of the first language, right? The first united language. So it's very important. So that would also mean that the Most High would have took away that knowledge of that language from all the world, even though they wasn't at Shinar. They would have lost the chain to that language. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like if someone speaks 2 languages, they'll know what I'm saying. Like let's say you lived, let's say you was in Japan, right? You know Japanese. You've been there for like 20 years of your life. You got it. Japanese is what you speak all the time. Then all of a sudden, 5 years later, you leave, you go to America, you get English, you learn it. So now you got English. Now you're speaking English all the time, but back in your head, you got this language that you know that in your town is your native language. So that's what was happening at that time. But when they come together, they had this native language. So when they can come to Shinar and they'll understand each other, they'll have a lingua franca. So it was like that city was one united, right? But anyone who didn't, like let's say a place where someone like America, or let's say like that same concept, right? If they went to another place, right, they may not know exactly how that's fixed. And let's go about that. I'm explain what I'm saying when it's all set up. So the writing system, that was the first lingua franca, the first writing system, right, and everything, and employed by a number of dependent language. So watch what it says here also. It says, an exception is classical Egyptian, right? Which, right, devised its writing system roughly at the same time as Sumerian, but never acquired the status of lingua franca. So now this is where it gets kind of interesting. Now, what does it mean? What does that mean? Let's go back to the map and try to get an understanding of what does that actually mean, right? What does that actually mean that Sumerian has a lingua franca, but the areas of Egypt didn't? Egypt wasn't the headquarters where Babel was going to be constructed. It needed no lingua franca because that wasn't the headquarters where all the people of the world was coming together and constructing their society. So what Nimrod was doing, remember, it didn't say that he had one city. It said he had, let's go back and read what it said, how many cities he had. right there. How many cities did it say his kingdom was? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know what is interesting is that there's a common story in the early writings that actually talks about the time of like Kish and a couple of different cities. They say there was these first 5 cities in that land, right? I'm not going to connect anything with that yet, but I just want to throw that out there, that there's also a external writing that says the first cities of Mesopotamia were 5 cities. But what's interesting, it talks about Nimrod having 5 cities in the lands of Shinar and everything. So it's kind of interesting when you think about that, just to kind of put that into perspective. So it was in the areas of Shinar where he would gather the people and build their Babylon, right? To build their Babel, their one tower, their one city, to build their one united company, right? So that's very important to understand of what we're looking at here. So a little more into Nimrod, a little deeper into it, into what's going on with Nimrod. Here's just an extra insights that I thought was interesting. This individual kind of took concepts and kind of broke down what's a way to see this all coming into to pass. I just want to use this interesting map because this is actually the map we want to look at right here. So what we're going to look at is the land of Shinar, which is actually going to be in this area here. You can see Kish there. You can see Babylon there, right? You're going to see a lot of different things that's there in these lands and whatnot. You see Uruk there, and that's going to be one of the early cities. They say there, right here was the city that we're going to talk about, Eridu. We're going to talk about this area here. We believe that this is going to be the area where Babylon was, the ancient Babylon. And we're going to kind of get a little understanding of that. Now, it's going to connect a lot of different cities here, but what's going to be important is kind of like how it's connected and how those things work. We're going to kind of look at these things. Now, if someone has a different opinion, that's all right, right? You can lay your facts down if you want to, or you can even provide sources or whatnot, as that's why I do these things live, so that others can present their case and whatnot. Because I do accept correction and I do accept looking at information. But from what I'm bringing out, whenever I bring it out, it's going to be one of the most scholarly agreed to pieces of information. So we're going to look at it and see why. So right here, I'm going to bring out this right here to kind of get over a little idea of a few things. So this is just another inside. I'm just gonna kind of leave this one alone. I think this one was the one I clicked. I probably copied it twice. I'm thinking, yeah. All right, I'm just gonna go down and kind of point this out. But the reason why, I think also I wanted to point out something here. Yeah, that's why I got this here. I wanted to point out something on here on this thing. And I'm gonna point out why. Because he points out something common within a certain time frame. Within this time frame, he points out something that I think is important to take note of, I think. All right. So this is what he says. He says right here, about in this time, we know we got the Uruk expansion. So that's when Uruk is expanding and everything. And this is what he says, archaeologists, right, pretty much, right? Archaeology pretty much shows that at the area of Tel Uruk, they find that it says, and also found at other sites after the great division of languages and land at the Tower of Babel, 2850 BC. Pretty much he's talking about what he's talking about, to kind of make it simple, is that at that same time, what we were just talking about earlier is that also Egypt starts, right? Pretty much what it talks about is like there's a lot of languages, a diversity of languages that's going to basically like start taking off at that time, is what he's saying. And he's basically saying that it makes sense for the transition of the things. So he's talking about it's going to make sense for how the things transition, pretty much. And that's what we're going to go about. We're going to go about it and point out why. How does it make sense? So, but we got to talk about the land Eridu. So the Eridu Genesis, there's an Eridu Genesis. There's a story of the beginning of some things, and we're going to point out some things. The Eridu Genesis may have been the first written record of a long oral tradition of a time around 2800 BC, when the Euphrates rose high above her banks and flooded the region. So it just talks about, well, that seems to be a natural flood that had happened in that area. So what's interesting is it looks like that flood had interrupted some building of some towers, and it may be that Babel was flooded. It may be that Babel was flooded. Now, I'm not saying that at time of Babel that was a global flood, but I'm saying the Most High, the way that he may have destroyed Babel, he may have caused, as he says, he caused the wind to blow, and it could have also had disrupted the river, and caused some of the water to also come and assist with that wind. So that's very important when we go over that how that area fell. So we're going to kind of look at Genesis. I think Genesis is going to be kind of interesting to take a look at. Let's go to Genesis. Let's go to Genesis 10 here. So we'll take a look at Genesis 10. So we know that the flood had happened and everything. And then it talks about the divisions of the sons and everything. And then it goes on about Nimrod. And it lets us know automatically that his city, he had a couple different cities in a couple different areas. So we already talked about Babel and Uruk and Akkad, right? Connecting areas of the Akkadians and everything. And he obviously would have had set himself in that area. But let me go over so that we can talk about Babel right here. So as we see, they all had one language and everything. So they would have all been together in that one area and had a lingo franca. So they would have been in an area where they had one language. And the whole world would have had that language because that would have been their lingo franca. That would have been their headquarters. That would have been the area of their city that they would build and whatnot. So, and remember, did they actually lay down the blueprints of that city? This is one of the biggest things that when they began to build, you got to ask yourself, how much did they build, right? And did they leave enough evidence to go back and find that exact city? That's what you got to ask yourself. But rather, we should also look at, is there evidence that that city inspired the people? Remember, he took away their language, but the visual thought is still in the heart of the early descendants. So that means that they can replicate that design. And what's interesting is in the Sumerian time frame, we'll start seeing a lot of replicas. It says, and they said, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven. Let us make us a name, right? So that's saying that the whole earth, all of them together are saying, let us make us a name. Let's make it all one, right? Whatever it is, now let us make us a name. Let us make it all one, right? Let us, right? Lest we be scattered abroad, right? Upon the face of the whole earth. And what did the Lord say? He went down and he saw, it says, and he went down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded, right? And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, right? And basically they are one language, right? And it's nothing that will restrain them, right? And then he just says, let's go down, confound the language so they don't understand and everything, and scatter them aboard, right, of the earth, right? And then watch what it says. And they left off to build the city. Now it says right here, they left off to build a city. Now, what was also interesting is that when the Most High came down to see what's going on and realized what they had thought, what's interesting is, remember, they were making a plan and they were going to try to build on that city. Now, it doesn't tell us what all blueprints were done. Now, because to build the city, they can also dig up the ground. They can work up the dirt. They can prepare the stones. They can still be preparing all those things, or they can have it halfway built, and then all of a sudden someone builds on it, because that's also what tells are. A tell is when someone else builds on it. So that also would make it very complex to find it. But what's interesting about it, it would inspire lots of people. So as people would leave that area, right, and see he scattered them aboard, we know that it would inspire a lot of people. And what's interesting is at that time frame, there's a lot of inspirations and examples of things that happened there. But first, we want to get a kind of a understanding of what's happening in that area. So somewhere, that's why there's these legends of Nimrod and the legends of this individual who basically built a tower in those lands. And we're gonna go over those things. So on the Eridu Genesis and some things, like we was pointing out, right? That was apparently a flood. And what's interesting about that flood, it says the desire for immortality, right, features basically is one of those basically things that we see in Mesopotamian literature and Sumerian writing specifically, right? Especially in the story that we was talking about, the story of Gilgamesh of Uruk, right? Uruk's link to Eridu is significant in that Eridu's, right, when talk about its importance, was later eclipsed by the rise of Uruk. So just to know that Eridu is actually going to be before Uruk, that's going to be something that we're going to point out as we go, because there's name changes or names that align together that we were pointing out earlier. Uruk is also still that same name that we was talking about early in Genesis that Nimrod actually was over. And remember, earlier it was Eridu. So that's going to be important to kind of get an understanding of these things, or what's happening here, right? So we're going to get some connections of some things, right? So just to go into that. So there's going to be some replacing and everything, and some interesting concepts. So remember, we was going to touch what a historian says. So here's what this historian says. This is an interesting quote here. I'm just going to show. Now, like I say, this one's a little later, right? This is going to be a later quote. So like I'm going to say, take that with how you're going to take that, right? So the 3rd century BC, but he's apparently a Babylonian historian. So he got some insight on some things. So this is what it says. Further, the Babylonian historian, I'm not trying to pronounce it, Baros, who was a major source for later Greek historians, seems to be clearly referring to Eridu when he writes of Babel as Babylon. His Babylon is in the southern marshes of the Euphrates, and is basically, he talks about it has their idols there and whatnot. Just leave that alone. This association strongly suggests that Eridu is the original biblical Babel, as the story of the great ziggurat Armsin was most likely passed down early before basically the historian wrote down the legend. So that's kind of interesting when you think about that there was some ties in that land with basically, how you say, what's the word I'm looking for, the biblical narrative and what some historians thought. So let's kind of look into that little area that they was talking about here, this Sin and whatnot, and what's going on there. But first, we got to get a little idea. Let's talk about the great ziggurat. What is a ziggurat, right? So the ziggurat, right, just talks about is basically pretty much, we had pointed out a little earlier, but we're going to go a little more into it. So it's just built at the center of the city. So a ziggurat usually is built at the center of the city of cities. So that's what's interesting, is that going back to the Bible here, on when it was talking about what he was going to go build, right? Let us build us a city and a tower. So it sounds like they wanted to build a ziggurat, because they would not just want to build a city, but they wanted to build a tower. So they could end up building a city and then building the tower in the center of it, because that's what a ziggurat is. A ziggurat, right, built at the center of the city, right, symbolically and basically it serves as the community's heart while they're at the palace and whatnot. So it's basically, long story short, it's pretty much a place where like the kingship is and everything, and A lot of people go to worship and whatnot. It's supposed to be like their head tower, right? You just look at it. It's the ziggurat. It's right in the center of the city, and it's like the main area of it. But we do know that it says as the basically the rulers change from the basically Uruk period to his later eras, it just talks about the different things about the ziggurat, that how the ziggurats basically their uses changed over time, right? And a lot of times over time they grew taller and larger. So it could be that, oh, they already had this idea of these designs, and all of a sudden let's build it to its highest extent, right? Just to kind of point these things out, right? So this is what a ziggurat is, right? You can see right there. A lot of times when they show like what is Babel, it looks like this, right? That's what a ziggurat is. A ziggurat actually will be in the center of the city, right? So you'll have a city around it, and then it'll be in the middle of the city. So it'll be right in the center. And then that's like where everyone want to go to. So that's something to kind of take a note of, that a ziggurat will be in the center of the city. So that's kind of interesting. He's a king of Uruk, whatnot. Very interesting stuff, I think. I want to make sure I point out this one that we were showing out earlier, Eridu. So we were just looking at that one earlier. And let's go a little more into it. All right. So during the Sumerian Uruk period, so like we were saying, 4000 to 2000 BC, ziggurats were raised in every city in honor of that community's pretty much their deity, for their idol, pretty much. So that's what they had those for. The ziggurat temple was not a public house of worship, but the earthly home of their idol, their god. So you can see how high that would be for them, right? So it'd be an earthly home of the god of that city, who was attested, or basically always visited by their high priest. So it's kind of like an early form of a holy place and whatnot. So that's what a ziggurat would also be, is going to be that quote unquote area, the house of their god. And it's going to be in the center of the city, and they go into the city, and then they basically would go to the ziggurat. Only the priests or whoever is anointed to go in, and they will go in and they will do whatever they're going to do, whatnot. And they'll say that's the house of their idol. But there's also a lot of stuff that happens in that place. So imagine if someone walks in there and say they're God, right? They walk in those places and say they're God or something. They're obviously in a house that's built for a god. And if he's like a king or something, then that just makes it even more difficult with that situation, right? So ziggurat construction continued. Obviously, it said it continued for a while, even to that these last phases and everything, and was adopted by the later Akkadian and the Babylonian and other societies in the region. So that's what's really interesting, right? That building practice that was being used. Now, this was interesting because we was kind of pointing out this earlier, right here, when we was talking about the ziggurat and everything, and then we said that the association strongly suggests that Eridu is the original biblical Babel by this historian that was saying that. He was saying that in the story of the great ziggurat, Aram Sin, right? You can see right there. Now, if you notice something, if we look at Aram Sin, it got some interesting things that's happening there that actually would lead to the third dynasty of Ur. So here's just a fire clay brick, right? And what's interesting is also like the way they built Babel and everything, right? They used it a certain method, and they basically built the city and whatnot. As it says, they had brick for stone and slime that they had for mortar, right? So that's very interesting. And they burned it, and they burned them thoroughly. So even the construction, right? Because this is actually a fired clay brick, so a burned brick, and they would have baked it, right? Just like the scripture says, right? It says, "Let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." Look how detailed the Bible is. It says to them, one another, let us go. So go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly, right? And they had brick for slime, for stone, and slime they had for mortar. So you can see what's going on there. Now, obviously, if you go into those root words more, you can go to how deep that's going. But notice this, that it says that they're going to get the brick and they're going to burn them. Right? So you can see, obviously, the story is starting to align very interestingly, because even the archaeological evidence is showing that that's what happened. It's, in fact, what you're seeing here is actually going to be that Erasin, that's actually going to be from Eridu, where that person said that Babel would have been at. But this individual says he apparently worked on the unfinished ziggurat at Eridu. There was apparently an unfinished ziggurat left by this individual, right? Now, what's interesting is that Erasin also supposed to be technically one of the individuals who is a moon god, but apparently, what's the word I'm looking for? He may have also been a person. He may have been a person, but he also may have been someone acting. I'll just basically explain what's going on here, basically, because you can even get an idea, right? He got his name basically from like the moon god and whatnot, but he may have been a ruler and whatnot. But his name translates to quote unquote immortal moon god and whatnot. So it's kind of interesting when you think about what's going on here, because even what's weird is that even the practices of the moon, like the moon and the star, you start to still see some of those things still later on. But I just thought this was kind of interesting that was mentioned. And right on this brick is that whole combination. And this brick is contesting that indeed it is what it's saying what it is, right? And here's from the British Museum, right? So from the British Museum, it says a yellowish fired clay brick. It says, got a 9-line description from basically Barasin or Erasim. And it's basically showing what it's saying on there and everything. So it's from a king of Ur, description from a king of Ur and everything. So third dynasty of Ur. So you can see at Eridu. So that's kind of interesting when you think about it, what's going on there. You know, it's kind of got some similar practices, the same similar practices that were happening early on in the scripture, right? But Eridu is an ancient land. Eridu is a very ancient land, right? Eridu been there for a long time. This is Eridu. It will be in the lands of Iran, basically in the area right above Iraq, whatnot. And this will be one of the little areas that will be basically set up and everything. But what's weird is, you know, you get kings list that says that they had kings there and whatnot for a long time. And remember, I talked about those 5 cities when I was talking about where Nimrod was and some of these cities where he was at and whatnot. It's interesting because you also get some sayings in the Sumerians kings list. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them, where it says Eridu is the first of 5 cities where kingship was received before a flood came over the land. So it's interesting. What's interesting there, right? When it says a flood came over the land, most likely, just like what we read earlier, there was a flood that came over the land and did some damage. And basically what happened, let's go back up. I was pointing this out earlier when we talk about that little flood. And that flood would not have been the catastrophic flood, but more of a flood that took down Babel. Apparently more of a flood that most likely had affected Babel. So they had written about right here in 28 BC, right, when the Euphrates rose and basically flooded the region, right? And that was something that they actually knew, something that had happened in that area, that they had a whole event that basically caused them to abandon a few ziggurats, pretty much, and basically especially the one that this individual had built. So that's kind of interesting to go into. I think it's kind of interesting to go into. But Eridu appears to be one of the earliest settlements in the region, founded 500 BC, right? Close to the Persian Gulf, near the mouth of the Euphrates River, right? So that's something that is also kind of interesting. It looks like that's how Nimrod and his successors, including Gilgamesh, controlled their subjects, moving them off the land and into cities, keeping them basically tight groups and taking their resources and stuff like that and whatnot. And the reason why is because in that little area, right? Just to kind of point that out, Nimrod and the return of Babel, right? Here's just a kind of an interesting insight that this individual kind of talks about when we talk about Uruk, the Uruk expansion and everything, and what was happening in that land, what was going on. He basically talks about, indeed, like, this stuff kind of comes together. There's a lot of scholarly consensus with all these things. It could be that that's what was going on. It could be that that's what was going on. But there's also interesting insights on who could Nimrod really be, right? Who could he really be? I think that he is who he is, just like the scripture says, right? And he would have settled in these areas of Mesopotamia, the major areas of Mesopotamia. So just like we went over the tale of Eridu, right? No doubt. And he would have definitely been in areas of Uruk and of and all those different areas around. So that's going to be very important. These major areas, he would have been affecting these areas. So most likely there was probably some events that caused, what's the word I'm looking for? A little change in that land. So causing a little change in that land. I think is kind of interesting to take note of. Now, we had talked a little bit about that land, a couple different structures of it. I just want to point out an interesting highlight that we was pointing out. So these little red dots here are kind of going to point out what we was talking about earlier, the Neolithic time frame. So after the transition of the Neolithic, it's going to go to these right here that are going to be more of the time frame we're talking about. So the one we were talking about was talk about this time frame where actually you're going to have the Eridu period. So that's going to be very interesting. And that transition throughout that time frame with Uruk and all that, that's where we're going to have all of a sudden the events happening. So it happens in the midst of that land. All of a sudden, there's this lingua franca that's dramatically rising up, and languages are going to be very diverse all over. But that lingua franca of Sumerian is going to be very important, and the culture ties that happen at that time are going to be very important because they tie together a lot of things harmoniously. And it makes it definitely look very clear that as the people had left this area, there were early individuals who ruled over the whole Levant, and it could have been a whole one family. That's why you got Hittites and Canaanites and all the ites after the sons of Ham. They would have had rulership over these areas. But something happened, just like how we see they were driven from that area, just like in the scripture. They were driven from that area. It doesn't seem like a lot of people died at that time. And that's also why, if you look at the genetics, it's almost like even the land's genetics completely changes. Like a dramatic shakeup of the land, right? A dramatic shakeup and a major change that happens in that land, right? So it's very, very interesting when you take note of that. That's how major the change is in that land, right? But then it goes on after the Neolithic. You have the Iron Age, and you're going to have different culture ties in that area. And we have pointed this out that Mesopotamia would have a lot of ties with the areas of Iran and the Indus Valley civilization, and also different groups that would have had ties over here. So this area would have been basically in ties with almost this whole area. This whole area would have been tied together. There would have been different traders that's making trades in that area. So they would have been making a lot of different trades in the area. So that would have been very, very important to kind of take note of. So that's something that I think is important to note when we think about who is Nimrod and where could Babel have been and what events could really bring these things together. So Sumer during that time was the era that had that lingua franca, and that's where they was together building and constructing Babel. And that transition would have been right at the time when language was being constructed. So as soon as that happened, they had to construct language. They needed to construct language because they lost their first lingua franca. They lost it. Whatever it was before, it was lost. And that's why we looked at that first evidence of the first language that was indeed lost. And then that's why language is still in use today, because without language, we can't have a uniform conversation. You can't have a uniform conversation without written language or a way to teach that language, right? There's other ways, like we could teach people just by speaking, but communication from distances requires some type of written way or some way to train others. So that's something that we do understand when we think about the difference between just having a language, just like one society having a language, a little group, versus like a lingua franca. So a lingua franca, everyone who comes and visit that area must know how to speak to everyone in that area. That's why Babel fell, because they couldn't understand each other, right? He didn't destroy them. They just didn't understand each other. He confounded their language. And so they didn't understand each other, right? And that's why it says, so he confounded them. It says, therefore they called the place Babel, right? Basically confusion. They called it Babel. So but most likely when they were building on it, it wasn't called Babel, but when it was finished, they called it Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of the earth. And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. So that means that a lot of them there, especially those that were already in that lingua franca, boom, it was scattered, right? That language was going, and a lot of people increased in that diversion, in basically scattering across the whole earth. That just like we was talking about before, when the whole earth was being filled. Now the earth is being completely filled, and that lingua franca is just, it's going to be broken. The first ever lingua franca is broken. So that's very important to kind of take a note of that. So this event, there's a lot of different things that can easily tie these events together, right? There's a lot of different concepts. Other eyepiece was interesting too. If you know, he points out, as I had pointed out also before, who I think is the most likely, Sargon. He seems likely, but the societal ties seem to point more to an individual that must have had it. He may not even be known, besides from the fact of some early writings in the Sumerian time. So he could be in the, just like there's a lingua franca in the Akkadian time frame. There's also a lingua franca in the Sumerian time frame. But I think that also in the concept of keeping a harmonious similarity comparison, you can compare Nimrod to Sargon, and you can compare him to Hammurabi, and you can find some very interesting similarities, right? Some are more challenging than others, right? How can you have a division of lingua francas in the time, or that lingua franca in the time of Hammurabi? But Akkadian was a lingua franca at that time, but it's remained for a while. So that's what will make you wonder, how does those make the language change? But if there was a pre-language that they all had, just like when I was talking about, if they had a ultimate original language, though some can have this other language that they would have at that time, later other branches of other languages, they would have a lingua franca, first lingua franca. Then all of a sudden it breaks. Then they have a dramatic need to write. They have a dramatic need to write, and most likely early on they were trying to still keep that same concept going on, of that Babel concept, and they all started copying each other. But that's what made them go at it. They all had their own gods. So a city with their own god and another with their own god, and they all start having their own gods. They all start having their own ziggurats. And that's what also caused them to be divided as well. So the original one was gone. The original concept that they had early on was gone. Then the Sumerians came together and they started building in the city. So that's something that is very interesting and evident when you start looking at the evidence. It makes a lot of sense that they started copying as the lands had came together at one point to build one ultimate ziggurat or one ultimate building that was going to basically unite them all together. So they're going to build a city and they're going to build the building, right? Notice what happened to the city. Did they ever say the city fell, or did they even build the city? Because remember, they were said they were going to build a city, but the Lord seen it, and he's seen the tower and took down the tower, right? So there's a couple of different interesting concepts to understand and bend together with the harmony of what happened in the time of Babel and how there's a lot of evidence that there was a Babel event that happened in the lands of Mesopotamia, that the events of Babel and Nimrod and the division of languages and the requirement of written language because of the confusion of languages was indeed evident in the areas of the beginning of the Sumerian empire, which is very, very interesting to get an idea of. So that's something I think is very interesting. And that's why you get little ideas from those little historians that we have seen of those places and their connections. Here's another historian to get another insight. There's Plato and there's other ones, but I'll just show one more. Here's Josephus on what he says. Now, the reason I'm showing Josephus is because he would have the Jewish thought at that time with the Judean thought at that time. So he's having the thought of the Judeans fresh right after the second temple falls, right? It's kind of like getting a concept from Judean during the time of the first temple. That would be kind of interesting, getting their thought and everything. This is getting the thought from an individual that will be there at the last phase of the temple, right? And what he ends up writing is that he writes a little bit about Nimrod. He writes a couple different things that I think is interesting that he says, right? He basically says, he says that he calls the people together and whatnot. He says, "Oh, let's go down and let's build a tower and whatnot." And what he says in it is kind of interesting, right? And again, taking this like with a grain of salt because this is written 2,000 more than 2,000 years later and everything. But it's interesting to get an insight of what he thought and what others thought at that time. So now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod, right, and esteemed it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. So that's really crazy that, even Josephus was saying that the people didn't want to submit to God. So the story of why they wanted to build that tower is very interesting and deep when you think about that they had a rebellion going on. There was a little rebellion that they had going on, and they wanted to rebel against God. It says, now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod, right? We can see that they didn't want to follow God. So as we know, just like we went over the information, what they do, burn the bricks, right? And it was built of burned bricks, right? Cemented together with mortar, right? So they talk about slime with mortar and everything. So cemented together. And basically it was established, right? To basically try to be something that's going to keep them from the flood and whatnot. But, it's quite interesting if the Most High also sent a flood to destroy the tower, which is that would just be poetic justice. It's like, why are you trying to build something to try to escape, but you're being rebellious to try and also trying to escape, Very, very interesting when you think about that. But then obviously that they got confused and everything, and then the people went their ways and whatnot. But it goes on and says, when all men were of one language, some of them built a high tower, if they would thereby ascend up to heaven. But the gods sent storms of wind and overthrew the tower. And you can see what's going on when it's talk about some things, because he's also was interesting make sure I go up and kind of point out what's going on right here. What's interesting, he's kind of like making a little side note that I think this little side note is kind of interesting to note here when you talk about how the storms and winds overthrew the tower, right? Kind of interesting because if you go back to that story by that other historian, he was talking about this era of sin and whatnot, and talked about, you know, that was Babel and whatnot. And we do some reflections into that little area. And what we have found out is that they had recorded some events that happened there. So this was that little area we was talking about with that little legend and everything and whatnot. But we have found out that that little legend is at Eridu, and there's an Eridu Genesis that actually records that around a certain time, the Euphrates rose high above the banks and flooded the region. Now, what would cause that to flood? You know, there's a lot of different ways to cause that to flood, right? And also wind and movement and all different things, right? Especially if it was a powerful wind, right? Like a hurricane or something, probably would do some damage. It would do a lot of damage or something like that, right? It's something that is kind of interesting when you kind of think about what's something that could have happened at that time. And it's kind of interesting how this historian kind of puts that same insight, right? So he's saying that indeed, he says, but the gods sent storms of wind and overthrew the towers and gave everyone his particular language. For this reason, it was that the city was called Babylon or Babel. So very interesting what's going on there, what's happening there, right? And we can see some different things that's said of these things. So it's just like an interesting little highlights. I think it's kind of interesting to go into. Point out this that I think is kind of. I'm gonna point out something on here that I think is kind of interesting. So this is why I say out of all of them, I believe it would be
epic. The Gilgamesh epic
it would be this.
describes the first God is dead movement. In the epic, the hero is a vile, filthy, perverted person, yet he is presented as the greatest, strongest hero that ever lived. Alexander Heidel, 1963, page 18. So that the one who sent the flood will not trouble them anymore, Gilgamesh sets out to kill the perpetrator. He takes with him a friend who is a monstrous, half-man, half-animal Enkidu. Together they go on a long journey to the Cedar Mountain to find and destroy the monster who sent the flood. Gilgamesh finds him and finally succeeds in cutting off the head of this creature, whose name is Huwawa, or Humbaba in the Assyrian version. See Heidel, 1963, page 34, second footnote. Is there a connection with the Gilgamesh epic and Genesis 10? Note what Gilgamesh says to Enkidu, the half-man, half-beast, who accompanied him on his journey, as found on Tablet 3, lines 147 through 150. If I fall, Gilgamesh says, I will establish a name for myself. Gilgamesh is fallen, they will say, in combat with terrible Huwawa. But the next 5 lines are missing from all tablets found so far. Can we speculate on what they say? Let's try. We suggest that those 5 lines include, but if I win, they will say, Gilgamesh, the mighty vanquisher of Huwawa. So
All right, so let's go a little bit into that. So now what he's saying is that there's a lot of similarities between what was being said there and what was being said in the book, right? So there's a lot of similarities, a lot of similarities between these different individuals, right? So it lets you know that he's a mighty hunter and whatnot, and is got that same saying and whatnot. A couple different things. I'm just gonna put this right here, so just kind of show this was just what was being said from that. I'm gonna leave this right here just to go back right here and kind of point out something here. So in this land, in this land right here is where we would have had that mystery Babylon, that Babel that would be rising up. That's also where it is said that individuals wanted to build a tower to survive the flood. Multiple different stories. There's also individuals who have roots in a historical sense that indeed that was the area where Babel was, and there was a catastrophic event that made it vanish, that made it end up going away. So, and we also know that there is scientific evidence that was a lingua franca there, and there was a proto or original ancient language that was there at that time. So there was an ancient language that they had a long time ago, which actually would give us some important understanding to what's going on in the time of the Bible. Let me make sure I see what's going on here. My cord came out. I don't want that to be out of there. All right. So that's just this is kind of like the kind of like a polish from yesterday. So this just kind of polish those things off to kind of show that there's a lot of different ties with that. So that's why, you know, this individual, this person seems like he would be, what's the word I'm looking for? Not a good guy, right? And it doesn't seem like Nimrod, from what the perspective looks like, and from the destruction of his tower, it doesn't seem like he was doing the best deeds or having the best of thoughts and whatnot. But this individual also having, now, obviously, I'm not saying everything of his legend is real. Most likely, obviously, is embellished, but he's going to have some interesting ties with this individual that basically has some similar concepts, especially this one part that I think is kind of interesting of what it's saying here when it's talking about its idol is taken down. But you can see what's going on here is that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a part of the writing where he basically describes God as dead. So he's basically, and it's kind of an idea that even like, if you think about atheists, a lot of atheists, there's a saying that say God is dead or stuff like that. What all this stuff. It's a concept of basically being able to do whatever you want and having no one over you. And a ziggurat, think about it. A ziggurat, the individual is literally building a house of God. Now, what if that first ziggurat and that house of God would be Nimrod in the center of it? Probably a lot of stories will see him as a god, right? And so all the replicas will be like replicas that will be born from the original and kind of like just being made and showing that's what happened there, that idea was developing in that land, right? But this is what it says. It says there's a saying in one of the tablets. So the third tablet in line 147 and 50, it says, "If I fall," Gilgamesh says, "I will establish a name for myself. Gilgamesh is fallen, and they will say, in combat with the terrible Aiwawa." So they also think that what's interesting is there's some missing parts of that. It says, but the next lines are missing from all tablets found so far. All right. So you can get an idea what might have been written there. And so they say probably, "If I win," they will say, "Gilgamesh, the mighty vanquisher of Awa." So they say like, oh, it sounds very similar to what says in Genesis 10 and 9, where it says right here, it says in those lines, says, "It is said Nimrod," right? So I'm like, you could replace it with Gilgamesh, "the mighty, right, hunter or vanquisher of Yahweh." All right. What sounds very interesting and what sounds very odd is that when you also take into consideration that apparently it was viewed that Nimrod was a bad guy, right? So why would he be a mighty hunter of God? Is he a mighty hunter of God as he works for God? Then why would he build Babel and God destroy that, right? So that's really interesting that maybe it seems like he was a mighty, try to be a vanquisher of the Lord, right? Or a hunter of the Lord, right? Think about that, right? Of the concept of what that would probably more mean in that sense, that he wanted to hunt God, right? That's why we also see when they said, "Let us come together," right? Let us come together and build a tower, lest we be scattered. Who will scatter them? And why they get say lest they be scattered? Because it's God. They're trying to challenge God. That's what this is showing. It's showing that the individuals came together, and their challenge was that they wanted to do something that God kind of stopped them, right? And they can ascend up to heaven and become gods. Think about that. If they want to ascend up to heaven, that's a ziggurat. That's what a ziggurat is. It's supposed to be the house of their god. So it makes perfect sense. It says, let us build a city. So they have to have a city and then a tower. So remember, a ziggurat is a tower in the center of a city. So, and they want to reach to heaven, just like what a ziggurat is. It's supposed to be a house of their idol, right? It's supposed to be a house of their idol, right? Just like we see with so when the first one designs, you see it was a nice bottom piece that they had there, and then they would have their little house that would be on the top of it. And that's where they would have their idol position, and they would have their priests go to it and whatnot. So you can see right there, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven, right? And let us make a name, they said, right? So you can see they already want to reach to heaven. They want to have their own name, right? And they're talking about lest they be scattered and whatnot, right? But the Lord saw it, and he knew it's not just it wasn't just that they were trying to build this thing. It was deeper than that. That's why the interesting thing of the Hebrews' thoughts of that time kind of brings some interesting insights on some things that they were thinking, what was actually in the minds of those individuals and what they actually did there. So that's kind of interesting. In that land, you would have that union of agreement to build a city, right? A city, and to build a tower within that city. So that's important. And that tower had to reach to heaven. It was going to be designed like a ziggurat. It makes perfect sense that that culture was happening there in the exact way of that culture, how they were burning the bricks. Now that's a very specific thing. They could have easily just built it out of clay, right? Or something. They could have did once, obviously do it out of clay or different ways. There's other ways to build this stuff with wood, right? All types of different things. But they decided to go the way that the Bible written about, that they came together and burned the clay, right? And with the mortar, right? And that's what is evident with these stones, that these stones are contesting that that's how they were building there, that they were still having to practice this, just like this fire burned brick and whatnot, what we're seeing here in the evidence of that area, that also that historian said Eridu, right? Because this one actually is at Eridu with his name stamped on there, right? So it was already cooked, then it was stamped, right? So that's just kind of giving the idea of that. It's probably even like giving a sense of that spirit of that, right? And that reflection and whatnot. But is right there at Eridu, where we actually would have evidence that apparently he worked on at the unfinished ziggurat at Eridu. So there was a unfinished ziggurat at Eridu, right? Unfinished ziggurat at Eridu, right? Unfinished ziggurat at Eridu, right? There's a lot of different information on that. If you ever want to go into it, we go a little deeper into it. But I think we went very deep today into some of the things of Eridu, right? We went into basically what happened there, whatnot, and what's going on with it, whatnot. That's something that's very interesting to take note of, right? But this is going to be a interesting summary insight of that time frame, that transition before Abraham comes in and whatnot. And also to take note of is that when Abraham does come in, we do not have to assume, because there is a later book that's written, the book of Jasher, and what we got to be careful on is when the translation of the modern Jasher versus the ancient Jasher was translated, because the later Jasher that's written later on, instead of being like an ancient writing, the later Jasher has some contradictions, major contradictions, and it claims some things that are dangerous. Like we're not even gonna get to right now. So you gotta be careful when going about even understanding the concept of this. I think yes, the biblical narrative is written in a pure form, and the synchronisms makes perfect sense for the basically transition of the Sumerian culture with the evidence of those ziggurats and the style of those ziggurats, right? Showing impression on the culture. So with that, family, that's all I got for today. It's just a quick summary there for what we need to understand. And later on at 2000 BC, we're going to go from 2000 BC into the biblical narrative. And we're going to point out Abraham's rise and whatnot and everything. So this was the time of Babel. After that, languages divide. And we went over this yesterday, what happened, how did languages divide, right? Right after the rise of the Sumerian cultures that we were just talking about, all of a sudden, that first lingua franca falls, and they have to build a language, the first Sumerian pictographic lingua franca. So they had obviously came together and said, we're going to all come together with one language and whatnot. That's why other places had similarities, like Egyptian had pictographics, but they didn't have a lingua franca yet, like with other places. So this one had the criteria of a lingua franca, Sumerian. But then other languages start coming in after Babel fell. So after Babel fell, then other places had their own languages. So you can see all these languages pop up a little later, but the first one was in Sumeria. So the first one was in Sumeria when they needed to develop those languages. But because everyone having different languages, they went out, settled in different places, root their languages down to say, okay, here's what our language is going to be so that everyone can understand each other. Now we're not going to be confused, is what they pretty much got to. They sat down and understood a written form, and they had their own languages and whatnot. So that was something that would be important to know. Here's another piece of how that transition would have happened, right? The events of Babel would have happened. All of a sudden, all those ziggurats being built, and then you got groups coming together saying, well, we need to build a writing system, a lingua franca, pretty much, and kind of get everything working together. Now, obviously, when they call it lingua franca, they would have called it one language, one united, agreed language, right? That they would have came together on. But after the fall of that language, then you're going to have all the written languages, the diversity of the written languages coming out, spreading across the whole world. The Most High took away the knowledge of the original language out of the minds of all the people of the world. They all would have lost that original lingua franca. So they couldn't come back to Sumeria, to the lands of Sumer. They all start developing their own languages. And then Akkadian popped in, replacing Sumerian. And a lot of Akkadians were trying to remember Sumerian. They were practicing. A lot of them were trying to practice. A lot of them had these double languages to try to remember how Sumerian was, but it got lost. Sumerian got lost. That's the language early on that ended up getting lost because they try to construct it to hold it together, but it was gone, right? So that was one of those things that had happened early on, and it just recently got translated. That's one of those big things that we understand. So that's something that had happened in the time of Babel. So we'll quickly summarize that what had happened. So written language pops up in that time frame, right? A lot of societies actually write a different flood record. So at that same time, I don't know if I mentioned that there's flood stories around the world. I'll just type it down. Because this one, there's a lot of stories and whatnot. A lot of them. There's lots of flood stories, right, around the world. Here's an example, right? We're talking all around the world, like literally all around the world, from one side to the other. They all have a flood story. So that's something that's actually kind of interesting when you think about it, of their little tale that they all have a event by the Bronze Age. They all root that something happened in the Neolithic. Something happened, and there was a catastrophic wipeout event. So now they're writing these things down. They're recording what had happened. So you can see great floods in almost everywhere. Mayan, America. These was happening all around the same time frame, right? All these things were happening around the same time. Just like we was talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh, that was a flood story, right? And there's other ones, right? The Sumerian creation myth, right? That's the one we just talked about a little earlier. Eridu Genesis, right? They also got flood stories in China and all types, all around the world, right? All around the world. I'll just copy this and save this to this thing because that's actually what happens, right? I'll just put that there for a little insight, right? Flood story summary. There's more to it on Answers in Genesis. They go into the flood stories and there's categories where they categorize each thing that's agreed with and things that aren't agreed with, because that's how like telephone games work. But at that time, all these languages, those stories don't pop up before. They pop in after the Sumerian lingo Franca pops up. And then you get those stories starting to pop up because they're all remembering what they were told, right? Their ancestors are telling them, well, we came from a flood. We came from events that had happened. So now they're telling each other every generation. That's what they have. They don't have no Twitter or Facebook, all that stuff. They have their legends and their stories and their truths, right? That's told from generation to generation, kept down and written down. That's going to be recorded for them. So that's going to be something that's very interesting and very important to take note of that land, all the stuff that's happening there and what's going on, right? So very, very interesting, I think. Very, 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 very interesting. So that's kind of an idea of, this is a small one, idea of a ziggurat. They will be in the center, and that would be their house of their idol, and only their priests will go in. That's a small one, but they got bigger over time. They kept getting bigger and bigger and whatnot. And most likely when the time of Babel, when that was there, they was going to build a massive one. They was going to try to reach to heaven. But that whole blueprint and that city was divided and destroyed. So that's something that's also important to know. So with that, that's all I got for now, unless someone got any questions. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, that was an illustration on a little edit to a little more information to what we was talking about yesterday. I'm going to now chart it down on here. I'm just going to put right here, I'm just going to type Genesis 10, because what that basically was, right? That was basically Genesis 10, right? That's basically what just happened there. So all this was Genesis 10, right? Because they had to make a name for themselves. They got to make legends, right? They got. If you're gonna make a name for yourself, you're not gonna say I was just some farmer that helped build some bricks. No, you're gonna say that no, I was part of the deities. You're gonna say I'm one with the deities. I'm one with the deity. In fact, we are the deities. That's what they would probably say more. It would lean more to things of that sort, and start making legends and start embellishing things, because they're not trying to be human anymore, right? They're trying to be gods. So that's why we went over that legend and how that connects with Nimrod, with all those combinations and how those things come together, right? So that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to come together and build a society for themselves and claim that they were the kings of the land, right? And not just the kings, but in a sense, the gods, because that's what we see also in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that man is half man, half god. Literally in the story, we went over the genealogy, that apparently he's from a man of Uruk, right? He's from the land of Uruk, but apparently he's half with a woman who's half god, a goddess, right? We went over that when we talked about that, but he's mentioned on the stones of the how you say the Sumerians kings list. So he's at the transition before the legend and the king, a physical king. So that's what makes it kind of interesting when going over these things, is that the biblical narrative kind of folds these legends and stories into its reality, that really it was just a man that gave an idea to the people, and it caused the people to have a divided language because they tried to come together and become gods. And that impression stayed on them for a while, and they were still, a lot of them, trying to become God, their own mini gods. That's why there were multiple mini ziggurats throughout the area after that. All right. So that's something that had happened later on because of the rebellion. So with that, it's definitely one of those videos that I think is paced. We paced it and is a little different than what we usually do, right? We get into like no genetics or anything like that, but we did go over the legend, the understanding, the biblical understanding of that land and how it makes actual academic sense that Sumer, the area, especially by its names that we was pointing out, right? Exact names, right? Isn't that absolutely interesting though, right? Isn't that absolutely interesting that the Bible mentioned actual real names of Mesopotamian areas and then described how the cities, how those ziggurats were built, how exactly those ziggurats were built with burnt rocks, right? The burnt mortar, right? Burning the clay and everything and building it up. And it was going to be a tower where it would be a claim that their gods would be, that they can reach to heaven, where they can make a name for themselves and everything. Right in Shinar, right near Akkad, right near Eridu, Uruk, or Uruk, how you say that, right? Near the lands of right? So Eridu is what we was looking at, and Uruk, right, was also what we was looking at, and we was looking at Shinar, which is in this area, and all these little areas were what we were talking about, right? So that was an individual. He could be from Cush, or he could be from the descendant of Cush, right? So that's something to consider, or he could just be named after a name because Nimrod, as I pointed out earlier, actually means to rebel. So that's actually something that's also interesting to consider, to think about. So I think that's very, very important to know about. But the practices of the fact, again, one more time, of the ziggurat, that is a city with a tower in the center of it, right? That's what a ziggurat is a city with a tower in the center of it where they say their gods are positioned. And at that time, all of a sudden, a lot of them were basically doing that, right? And they know that later on, they also know that some of those cities were basically for their king and whatnot, their successful kings when they had claimed themselves to be gods at times. But we do know that they were built a certain way, especially when we looked at Eridu, that they did have those fired clay bricks, right? And even one that we found that was stamped by the name of the king of that land, which actually his name has some interesting ties to idols that we were talking about early on, right? That's what they were doing. They were turning themselves to myths and they were claiming themselves to be gods. That's why I said they were going to make a city up to heaven and they're going to make a name for themselves, right? So very, very interesting. Very, very interesting, I think. So with that, family, that was what I believe is the biblical and academic area of where Nimrod was and where Babel started off at before Abraham is going to enter into the biblical frame and the historical frame. So with that, family, may you be blessed, may you be beloved, and amen, family.